Did Muhammad lead an invasion on Palestine? The Islamic voices say no, he died in 632. Non-Muslim sources that date earlier than the Muslim sources say he was alive at the invasion of Palestine, that he may have been there as an apocalyptic voice, someone who thinks the end is about to happen. Today, Dr. Stephen J. Shoemaker takes a deep dive with me on MythVision, discussing this very issue of apocalypticism, but also why was Jerusalem in the direction that Muslims used to pray? And then that shifts and they relocate that direction. Early voices may be hinted at Muslim sources, but just like Christianity shifts and change, and it doesn't take long for that to happen, the same may have happened on the Islamic voices. Are they trustworthy? Are their sources accurate? And this is why being critical, being a critical scholar, is necessary when we approach this subject matter. I hope you take the deep dive with us and go get his books, because they're amazing. MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an extremely special treat today. I cannot tell you how honored I am today to be the first person remotely on the YouTube waves, if you will, to interview Dr. Stephen J. Shoemaker. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on.
I really do appreciate you. And if you don't mind, I just want to give a special shout out to Dr. Sean Anthony. Thank you, brother, for helping encourage him to give me this opportunity. And of course, with your wonderful scholarship, and Dr. Bart D. Ehrman for also putting in a good word for MythVision and giving us this opportunity. I really appreciate both of you. Thank you, gentlemen, for that. This is your first time joining us here at MythVision. So I wanted to allow you, if you don't mind, to tell us your credential, your background, a little bit about you, because instead of me reading out this long bio, and trust me, you have a long bio with a lot of experience, how would you describe yourself for a lay audience that's out there watching this today?
The simplest explanation is I work on the history of religion in the early Middle Ages, the end of antiquity, and what's today the Middle East.
Simply put, and he has credentials to back that up. I really highly recommend everybody to go get. Specifically, we're going to be discussing Islam and its early rise, but these are the three books. I cannot tell you how important these are on reading. He's a paradigm changer, really. His work is pioneering an idea of apocalypticism in early Islam, unlike anyone else that I've been reading. Others make hints to it, but this is highly recommended. I suggest that. I also highly suggest go down in the description. Look at the Amazon link. He also has books on Mary. Hopefully we can explore that someday. There's a lot of material here. Go check him out. Stephen J. Shoemaker down in the description. So I do appreciate that. Everybody, make sure you go help support the guests that I have on. That's the reason they're here. So with that being said, I also wanted to mention that if people wanted to go to the university you're at, they could potentially go check out your actual website and sign up if they wanted to go to college and listen to you teach in person. Can you tell us a little bit about your website?
Well, it's mostly a website for teaching purposes. I started doing online things back when I first started teaching around the late 90s, and was trying to use a lot of public domain stuff to save my students money back then. And I've just kind of stuck with it. I've updated it a little bit maybe to promote some of my work a little better. You can see the books down the side there, and I have a link to the Journal of Early Christian Studies up at the top there, which I'm the editor of that. It's the most prestigious journal in the field of early Christian studies. I'm very proud to say.
Oh, wow.
So it also can bring some people there, but yeah, it's mainly a teaching website. Most of my hits, I think, come from students. I require hits, in effect. So,
Well, I enjoyed going here and checking it out. I wish I could join and check out your courses and be taught by you in person based on what I've actually heard. So thank you so much for giving us that. I just want people to know how they can go support with, where they can go and support and really educate themselves, because there's so much here. So, Professor, to start with, I want to show you what got me interested in the topic of the discussion today. And it was this clip that I found of Dr. Robert Hoyland that I'd like to play, if you don't mind.
The observations that are made by non-Muslim sources are a bit difficult to know what to deal with. So, for example, they say that Muhammad is alive during the conquest of Jerusalem. So he's alive. In the Muslim accounts, he dies in Arabia. And that's it. Before the conquest had properly started, that happens with his successor, Abu Bakr. But in a number of Christian sources, they have him go to Palestine. And the aim, it seems, is that he wants to capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem is key to his program in the Christian account, but that's not really there in the Muslim account.
That really piqued my interest. You could see why.
Yeah, sure.
Have you met Dr. Hoyland, and what are your thoughts maybe?
Only a couple times. Oh, he's a real inspiration. I mean, his work on seeing Islam really made this all possible in a way for folks to just look at the full panoply of the sources available for thinking about the beginnings of Islam, right? I mean, he wasn't the first to sort of draw our attention to this. I think we owe that to Sebastian Brock and to Patricia Crona and Michael Cook. But he was the first to systematically inventory all of these texts. And up until that point, really, we're talking the late 70s. It's not that long ago when Brock and Crona and Cook first said, hey, what about all the Christian sources? People were only looking at the Islamic sources for any knowledge of the beginnings of Islam. And of course, it's no secret that these sources are all written down very late. They are based on memories that are being told orally for 100 years, at least in most cases. The Christian sources or the non-Islamic sources, by and large, are written, in the middle of things to a large extent. Some of them are later. He catalogs those as well, but they're all a very important witness to what is going on in this part of the world in this time and place. I mean, it's, for instance, I suppose a lot of your audience is familiar with early Christian studies, right? No one who's trying to understand the beginnings of Christianity would just simply ignore all of the evidence we can glean from Greco-Roman literature for understanding the context and even understanding what these people are saying about Christianity. So, yeah.
Well put. Very well put. So the title of the show today is Did Muhammad Lead an Invasion of Palestine? If you're ready, let's begin. So the first thing I'd like to bring up is Sebeos. If I'm pronouncing that correct, is it Sebeos?
I would say Sebeos.
Sebeos. Okay, I want to try and be on the same wavelength of pronunciation as much as possible. So Sebeos, I would like to start by showing a video of our first manuscript, Sebeos. This manuscript is kept at and I'm going to butcher this, Matenadaran in Yervan, Armenia.
Matenadaran in Yervan.
Yerevan, Armenia.
Matenadaran.
I tried. I really did.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. It's a mouthful.
For anybody who's wanting to source me, and I hope they do, especially if you're being critical of what I have going on, here's the website that you can go and actually check it out yourself. So make sure you do so. With that being said, let me go ahead and play the clip.
For the first time in Armenian, someone talks about Muhammad and mentions him by name and says a little bit about what he did. Sebeos himself was talking about the events around the year 630. Which was before Muhammad had actually died.
Sebeos gives a surprisingly accurate account of Muhammad's background and teachings.
Translating from the Armenian. At that time, a certain man whose name was Mahmed, which is the usual name for Muhammad in Armenian, a merchant, as if by the command of God, appeared to them as a preacher. Now, Muhammad gave them laws, namely, not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsehood, and not to engage in fornication.
There's a short clip of Sebeos.
Yeah.
And so this is a voice that, like you said, we wouldn't want to ignore Greco-Roman sources on Christianity that are non-Christian, and Sebeos is one of these that is non-Muslim. And this manuscript is a printed version of several Armenian texts, out of which one of them is Sebeos. It was copied in 1672 from the original Sebeos manuscript, which was written in 660 AD. And I just want to mention that. Can you tell us more about this and how important it is?
Yeah, this account from Sebeos is, I would say, probably the single most important account we have about the beginnings of Muhammad's new religious movement, which is, for various reasons, I don't call Islam at this point. I don't think they even call themselves Muslims at this point. And Islam is something that develops later out of this religion. They seem to have called themselves the believers, which is a hypothesis that Fred Donner advanced, and I think is quite correct. So I think it's probably the best witness we have. And for instance, actually, my friend and colleague, Sean Anthony, who you also mentioned, we more or less agree on this. We disagree about a lot of stuff. We work together about things. We're friends. We argue a lot. But one thing I think we're both agreed on, and forgive me, Sean, if I'm speaking out of turn for you, but we both agree that this account from Sebeos is really, really important. Now, how we understand it, well, he and I might understand it somewhat differently, but it's not just that the chronicle is written around 660, we think, but according to Robert Thompson and the others who've worked on it, the chronicle made use of older sources. And we believe that for this section, or they believe, and I believe them, they're more expert on this than I am, that this particular section about the beginnings of Islam was probably written around the 640s by an author in Jerusalem. And this author tells us that he got his information by talking with people who had been taken captive among Muhammad's followers and had spent some time with them. So, can we believe any of this? Well, it's always a question. I mean, this is the thing about trying to reconstruct the past. We have to be suspicious, but we're also trying to find what's probable. And there are a lot of probables in favor of this source being as reliable a source as we're going to find. And one of the things that's interesting about it, too, is as it continues on, this was something that wasn't in your clip from Robert Thompson, Sebeos talks about how Muhammad and his followers, a group of Jews and Arabs together, united together in a single cause, their goal was to liberate the Holy Land, the promised land of Abraham. They're both descendants of Abraham. Right? They both, as descendants of Abraham, have a right to the land according to biblical tradition. And so this would explain, right? I go back to your comment from Professor Hoyland, Robert, the other Robert. It does seem there's a lot of noise in the non-Christian sources around their main goal and the Holy Land. And now he suggested something, I think that in the Islamic sources, there's not so much to corroborate that, but I think there is. And I've written about this. You'll see some of this in The Death of a Prophet, especially, and also in Apocalypse of Empire. There is a lot of noise also in the Islamic tradition about Jerusalem. And you only have to look at the Dome of the Rock to see that there's something going on there, right? This was the first Islamic monument built. It's not a mosque. It's built over the site of the temple. Right? Jerusalem still retains this third holiest status in the Islamic tradition today. All of Islam's eschatological traditions, its apocalyptic traditions, remain soldered to Jerusalem and to the Temple Mount. Now, where's all this coming from if it's not that Jerusalem was important pretty early on, right? If from the beginning it had been all about Mecca and Medina, then why would all this stuff for Jerusalem come in the first place, right? On the other hand, if Jerusalem was important in the beginning, and then things sort of shifted a little bit and Mecca and Medina became more important, then it's kind of easy to understand why there are all these vestiges of Jerusalem's significance lying around in a religion that for centuries now has seen Mecca and Medina as its main holy places.
Wow. That is wonderfully put. I really appreciate you talking about that. And we're going to bring up a few of those sources visually for people here in just the coming time. The Doctrina Jacobi, am I saying this correct? Jacobi? Doctrina Jacobi?
Again, I would say Jacobi, but, potato patata.
Hey, just making sure, I'm trying. I would like to show our second manuscript, the Doctrina Jacobi, if I'm saying this correct. This manuscript is kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And just for everybody to do a good service and be critical, go and check it out. In fact, you can do the website in French or English to go check my sources. You think I'm making this up? Go check it out yourself. I'm saying that for those who are so skeptical, you can't believe a word I'm saying, and I understand. That's okay. So just for everybody's awareness, this particular manuscript is a 10th century copy of the original that was written in 634 AD in Greek. Inside of the red portion is the actual part of the text that says, a prophet appeared with the Saracens, or if you will, Arabs. Can you tell us a little bit about this situation here between these two? This is just a continuation of the next page on the Doctrine of Jacob.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an incredibly remarkable text. There's there's some people who would debate it, who would place it a little bit later in time, but there's a pretty strong consensus at the moment that this is indeed a text that reflects some circumstances in 634 in a particular community of converted Jews in North Africa. The broader context of all of this is it's a debate among these Jews. There had been a forced baptism, and many of the Jews had been baptized unwillingly, and some of them decided, well, okay, let's become Christians, and they're debating about, whether this was a good idea, and then someone new comes in who wasn't there when all this happened, and now he's having a debate with them about whether they should have embraced Christianity. And then sort of in the middle of all of this, someone gets a letter from a relative who's back in Palestine, and this letter says, hey, here's what's going on back here in Palestine. This prophet has appeared coming with the Saracens, right? And the account continues. It says, he says he has the keys of the kingdom, if I remember correctly. And there's the Jewish author says that he seems to be preaching that the Messiah is coming. Whether that's something that was actually this prophet was saying, or whether that's how it sounded in Jewish ears, that's another question. Although I think it could be both ways. But yeah, this is the first source we have that mentions Muhammad, not by name. But I run in some interesting groups. I mean, I have some colleagues who want to argue that Muhammad didn't even exist, and that the name Muhammad is the name Muhammad, right, just means the praised one. And so it's not really a name. It's just it's a title that was given to him, and but he wasn't really a real person and things like that. Well, to them, I say, actually, the two sources we've talked about put that to rest. And I know Bart, who was one of my mentors, he had to write a whole book, arguing that Jesus actually existed. Some people are so skeptical. I hope I'm not offending any of your audience out there, but
no.
These kind of things are a little too skeptical, right? Again, we're dealing with probability, and it's highly probable that Jesus existed. It's highly probable that there was a prophet who his followers called Muhammad, who was at the beginning of this religious movement, right? And two main sources are going to be that we have this text from 634 saying that he's alive and he's coming to the Holy Land. And then we also have this text, which we just talked about, Sebeos, right, which names him Mahmed. And so between these two, I think there's, it's pretty hard to to me, you're wasting time about something that's relatively, if you're arguing that, you're wasting time about something that's pretty settled, when there are a lot more interesting things to debate that are up in the air. So
I'm with you on that, and I'm definitely someone who thinks that it's more probable there was a guy, though I wouldn't mind interviewing someone who's an academic who is taking a different position. I'd be interested to hear what they have to say, but I'm like that with you as well in that particular position. Moving on to Michael the Syrian. Now we move on to our third manuscript, and I want everybody to take the opportunity to look at this particular church. This is this church, St. George Church in Aleppo, Syria, is actually where they keep the manuscript, or is kept. It's kept there right now. And, you can look into this yourself. This is the manuscript that we're talking about. And it's a copy of the original written in Syriac before 1199 AD. In particular, what we're trying to zero in on is this part right here. And this part right here on this manuscript, the translation of the yellow highlighted text says, he began to make from them for himself a band, and he went out to make raids in the land of Palestine. Isn't this indisputable proof that Muhammad did lead an invasion into Palestine? At least historically, if we're making an argument. What are your thoughts?
Well, what it proves is that someone remembered that, right? Now, that's another step to say, why did they remember that? Did they remember that because that's what really happened? Or is there another reason that that memory came to be? That's one sort of way to look at this. Another way to look at this too is, what does Palestine mean? Because so we think of Palestine as maybe what's today the land that has the states of Israel and Palestine in it. In the Roman period, Palestine was much larger, and so there was a region of Palestine that went fairly far out into the deserts to the east and the south of the Roman Empire. And we do indeed in Muhammad's biographies have some traditions of him leading raids up into this territory. So is that all it is? It could be, but what we find instead is, we find out that's not the only piece of evidence. If that were the only thing that said Muhammad went to Palestine, then it would be pretty reasonable to say, yeah, that's what it's referring to. But when we pull together all these other sources, right, and in the death of a prophet, I think I have 11 or 12 of them. I can't remember. One of them is a Jewish source, actually. They're not all Christian sources, as Robert said. And one of them is an early Islamic source that seems to indicate that Muhammad was going with them as they went forth into this part of the world. And the Christian sources are spread out, in different confessional communities. The Christians are divided amongst themselves at this point. But we have a source from Spain that says, we have this Armenian source, right? We have Arabic Egyptian sources. We've got this Greek source from North Africa, right? When you get those of your viewers who do know historical Jesus stuff, who know Bart stuff, we're talking about multiple independent attestation, right? We're talking about a tradition that is reported independently multiple times, right? And when you have that kind of evidence, that's the gold standard, as I always say. That's the best we're going to get. So what we have is not just a report in the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, which is quite late, actually. And the value of that witness depends on the fact that it seems to be using an older source that eventually goes back into the early 8th century, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've worked on some of this. But when you get all of this together, you have to reckon with the fact that there clearly was, in the 7th century, a memory that Muhammad was still alive at the time of the Islamic conquest. Does that mean that actually happened? I can't say that. What I can say is, for some reason, a lot of different people were remembering that time in a way that involved Muhammad's leadership of this invasion of the Near East. Not necessarily even just Palestine. Some sources are more vague, saying he's leading the leadership of the Near East, which he's supposed to die in Medina before any of that happens. And here's another thing with this tradition. We don't get any tradition that contradicts it. So we have multiple independent attestation in a dozen sources from all over the place in the 1st century of Islam. We don't get anything that contradicts it until 100 years after Muhammad's death. And that's when we get the first written records of the Islamic tradition about the end of Muhammad's life, where he becomes ill and dies in Medina before all of this happens. Now, is it possible that what the Islamic tradition remembers is true? Yes, it is possible, right? But on the other hand, is it possible that these other reports, which are earlier and which, unlike the Islamic tradition, have multiple independent attestation in their favor, that at least we could say that this was the earliest memory about the end of Muhammad's life, right? Maybe it's not true either, but I think the evidence speaks very strongly that the earliest memory was of Muhammad still alive and leading at this time. And the Islamic tradition has a different memory that only appears later on. And so what the death of a prophet was basically an attempt to think about, well, okay, how do we deal with this difference in our sources, right? And how would someone say this was Jesus, if we had traditions about Jesus that were like this, right? How would someone who was a Jesus scholar, who was a New Testament scholar, go about trying to sort through the different reports? and validate them historically. And if we think this was an early tradition, that Muhammad was still alive, why do we get a later tradition in the Islamic sources that he died before all this happened? And the broader argument you'll see across a lot of my books is, again, it goes back to this reorientation about Jerusalem. I think it's really clear that they were more interested in Jerusalem than they were in Mecca and Medina in the early decades. This is not a horribly controversial thing to say even, right? The original direction of prayer, it's quite clear. Very few people would dispute this, was Jerusalem. Even in the Islamic sources, there's a memory of this, right? What's going on? Well, I think Jerusalem was their main holy site. It was the aspiration of their religion in these early decades, and only later, for a variety of reasons. And I guess I'll give you a teaser. If you want to find out why, you got to buy the book. It's a little complicated to explain here too, but their sacred geography, I think, changes. I think Jerusalem's important at first. Mecca and Medina become more important later on. Some people say, oh, they had nothing to do with Mecca and Medina. Well, again, I think that we don't have to go there, right? We don't have to go there. We can simply say, well, here's a pattern that Jerusalem seems to have been important originally. Mecca and Medina probably emerged as important later on. And I think if we're looking for a context in which memories about how Muhammad ended his life could change, it's in the context of that change. Right? Once Jerusalem and the Holy Land isn't the end-all be-all, but Mecca and Medina become what's important, you're going to want to remember the end of Muhammad's life in a way that fits with what you believe. And that is, as we get into the 8th century, the holiness of Mecca and Medina as a unique, distinctly Islamic Holy Land.
This factors in wonderful stuff that Sean Anthony talks about in his book about whether Muhammad was a shepherd or a merchant, and the non-Muslim sources, they don't shy away. They just say, yeah, he was a merchant. He was this, he was that. And then you have this kind of shy away happening where he's more of a shepherd in the Islamic tradition. So I think you're onto something here. Maybe we'll talk more about that as we get through. Once we're done with some of these sources, it'll be cool to maybe like small talk on a little bit of this here. But this fragment of the Arab Conquest in 636 AD, this little circled spot right here, I think is Robert Hoyland's actual he had circled this initially where Muhammad's name comes up. Can you tell us about the fragment of the Arab Conquest?
I looked at it once a long time ago. I think it's debated whether this is actually reconstructed as Muhammad. So there's not universal agreement that this is, if I'm remembering correctly, there's not universal agreement that this is the earliest attestation of Muhammad. And this is a pretty vague fragment. It doesn't tell us much other than that the followers of Muhammad had appeared on the scene, right? That could mean a lot of things, actually, right? I mean, the followers of Muhammad could be people who were following Muhammad who was dead by this time, right? So again, on its own, if this were the only source that had any kind of indication in this regard, we would probably say, yeah, well, that's what it means, right? But when you start lining it up again with all these other reports, you kind of have to wonder if even this source, as vague as it is also bearing witness to a group of Muhammad's followers who are coming into the Near East, quite possibly with him still as their leader.
Wow. Okay. What about this source, Thomas the Presbyter, 640 AD? Is there anything magical about this that we should look at?
Yeah, I'm racking my head. I can't remember exactly what that source says without looking at it. And I don't have, I'm not with, my library is not here with me in Germany, unfortunately. And I haven't been thinking about this stuff in a while. But actually, if you want to see what Thomas says, by the way, shameless plug, you can go get my book, The Prophet Has Appeared, which translates all of these sources with historical commentary. It's really designed for classroom use, so I think it would be good for a lot of your audience. Yep, there it is. A prophet has appeared. So we can all go look at that and refresh our memories as to what.
I can't recommend these books enough. Like, I really hope people will take the time to go get them, and they're fun to read. Even the introduction I'm currently reading, in particular, on the book on the far right for those watching, The Apocalypse of Empire. It forces me to have the death of a prophet. And then that's forcing me. I'm going backwards, of course, you could already tell, but I'm really, really wanting to get through all this stuff. And maybe we can have an episode teasing everybody to join and go get it and take a look at it. So I want to do a connection between Sebeos and the Doctrina Jacobi, or I hope I'm saying this right. Here's an analogy. Let's say Sebeos reported that Derek, it's me, was an owner of a podcast called MythVision, And Derek said that the best place to party is in New York, and he went out with some hippies. And the Doctrina Jacobi said in New York, there was this guy who was an owner of a podcast, and he came to a party with some hippies. Surely putting two and two together, the person identified would imply it's most likely me. It just wouldn't make any sense to probably go any other way, especially during this time, I suspect, if we were to put this back in time. Would you in particular think that's a good analogy, or would you have a better analogy to maybe put for connecting the two sources there?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think they're significant, right? I think the fact that there is this, the way I would look at it as a historian is I would say, well, there's a memory of some guy named Derek having gone to New York to party with some hippies, right? Memory is a tricky thing. The older you get, the more you learn this. And, it could be that they both are dependent on someone's misunderstanding of something. Right. I mean, this is always the case. Someone misunderstood the nature of Muhammad, or misremembered the name of this guy who was there with the party and then told two people, and then that's how they told it. Now, this is why, again, this idea of multiple independent attestation is so important. Now, if we had 10 sources that said something like this about Derek and his partying hippies, I would think we'd want to take it seriously. And I guess that's the main thing. Was the main point of Death of a Prophet was you can't ignore this. I don't know if it's true. I really don't. I mean, it's hard to know what happened long ago. These people didn't have an idea of trying to be historically accurate like we did in every case. But I don't see any way to avoid concluding that there was a memory, and it was the earliest memory, and it was from the 7th century, that Muhammad was alive at the time that and leading his followers at the time when they invaded the Near East into the 630s, mid 630s, after he's supposed to have been dead in Medina. If other people want to come up with other interpretations of what that means, or why we would have these two different traditions, I'm all for it. I've given mine, but it was mostly it's the whole point of that book was like, hey, look, you can't just pretend this didn't happen. And all due respect to Robert Hoyland, who I admire a great deal, it was an article of his that largely inspired me to write The Death of a Prophet. The whole story with that book goes back to when I was in graduate school. Probably my best friend at the time was a guy named John Lamoureux, who works on Christian Arabic, and he was doing a PhD in Islam at the time, and he trained a lot in Christian studies before that. And we would always talk about, why isn't there a critical discourse on the Quran and on early Islam the way there is on early Judaism and early Christianity? And that's a whole nother kettle of fish, as it were, to talk some about that. But he brought up to me, he made me aware of this book called Hagerism by Patricia Cronin and Michael Cook, which is absolutely brilliant work, and it's absolutely flawed. But it just, for the first time, said, hey, look at all the things that the Christian sources are saying, and we can't just keep ignoring those. And in all that, the one that stuck out to me like a diamond was this passage that Muhammad's still alive at the time of the conquest. And, they mention it, and I go back and look at the footnotes, and I'm looking at the sources this is in, and it's like light bulbs are going on over my head, like, wow, multiple independent attestation, because I've been trained in biblical studies. This is good stuff. Why is everyone just ignoring this? And I kind of put it in the back burner and thought, maybe someday I'll write something about that. And then it was Robert wrote a nice article about Life of Muhammad in Christian Sources. It was in an edited volume somewhere. This is Robert Hoyland, not Robert Thompson. And then he said, basically, the Christian sources say this, but of course they're all wrong. I mean, it's not a direct quote, but I think it's a pretty accurate paraphrase. Okay, that's out there now. So now something has to be said. I started out to write an article. I was hoping I could just write a quick article that would point this out. Look, here's this evidence. Biblical scholars would take this real seriously. And then it became a very long book, actually, which kind of surprised me, which is The Death of a Prophet. So again, it's a lot of it is about trying to hold things to the same standard, right? Trying to study this. I think this is important for the discourse of religious studies. We're critical of religion. We're critical of things that people hold very dear. as dear as the people they love, their parents. And we're like being critical of people's parents, right? So it's hard. It comes as a hard blow sometimes for people. But one of the things I think is important for someone who is a scholar of the critical study of religion is to be consistent and to say, you know what, this isn't personal. This isn't your mother. I'm doing the same thing to everyone else's mother.
Exactly.
Right? I'm going to ask the same critical questions about my tradition, your tradition, everybody's tradition. And this hasn't been being done in the study of Islam. There are exceptions. I'm not, the voice of one crying in the wilderness by any means. But as I think you've realized, and probably some of your viewers have as well, it's a real minority voice, and it is very much marginalized within the academy and study of Islam. I don't know that I could write the kind of things I'm interested in writing if I were an Islamicist rather than a historian of late ancient and early medieval religion. Because, again, there are pressures in the academy, and not always for the wrong reasons, to be clear, not to be critical of Islam, right? And I'm not trying to be critical of Islam. I'm trying to be a critical historian, right? Simply asking questions using the same frame of mind, the same methods, the same skepticism that I would for any other tradition. It's not any kind of critique of Islam any more than doing it for Christianity is a critique of Christianity or a critique of Judaism or a critique of Buddhism or Hinduism, take your pick. It's just about creating a kind of critical discourse about these traditions for those people who are interested in that approach, right? We scholars of religion, we're not out here trying to, well, most of us, I would say, I certainly speak for myself in this regard, and I know many others, we're not out trying to prove that religion isn't true. We're not trying to show that it's a bad thing. We're just interested in understanding it through this particular lens. And I, for one, am very committed to what we can learn, what even people of faith can learn about their own tradition from, looking at it from this different way. And as one committed to that, it's important to me intellectually. It's also important to me pedagogically in the classroom to have this kind of consistency. If we're going to present our undergraduate students with a very skeptical, critical view of these other religious traditions, I think it's only fair that we also have a discourse about Islam that we teach them that is grounded in the same kind of principles. But anyway, I'm going on too long.
No. I love it. I'm glad. I wanted you to do that. I'm glad that you actually are expressing that, because one of the things that happens in the world I live in terms of YouTube world, the internet world, and then you got people on corners that are arguing and debating, is typically the criticism I hear that is trying to be critical of Islam or the tradition and the history and the prophet and stuff are mostly coming from Christian fundamentalists who are trying to say mine is better than yours, okay? And there's this competition where the Muslims are saying mine is better than yours. I've kind of came in this weird little entrance where it's like, I'm going to be critical of all of this, just like I'm critical with Christianity, just like I'm critical with the Hebrew Bible, which in effect, if you're a religious, devout person, you will not like the things that I may say, because I'm looking at this as an anthropologist somewhat, like an anthropological approach where I'm like, in what way did man cleverly or even superstitiously come up with these particular things, and seeing how it's developed? For me, I was impacted negatively by my fundamentalist past. And so many people have been like, wow, this channel is a breath of fresh air, because it's actually still enjoying the religious study, still enjoying understanding these people who impacted the world in such a way, and knowing that that was good maybe at the time for them in that particular region, like that was good. Let's not practice what happened in 7th century from anyone. People like to pick on Muhammad and act like he's the only one who had a sword. Get out of my face with that. Everybody was bloodthirsty, but we all should grow and advance and go past that. So there's, in a sense, we're trying to have interfaith dialogue, simultaneously being willing to go in places that the faith bubble doesn't let you go past. That's my...
Right. No, I mean, this is an important point. There are real anti-Islamic polemicists out there. It's not always even just a religious agenda. There are also political issues and concerned with Middle Eastern politics, I think, that drive some of this and drive that on both ends as well in some of the discussion around Islam. But violence is definitely a topic that comes up. It's one that's very, I think it's a bit delicate to talk about on YouTube in some ways, but I've certainly written about it, and I think what you say is exactly right, that Muhammad was a man of the 7th century. We shouldn't judge him otherwise. He was a political leader in the 7th century. So what would that be in Christianity? That would be Charlemagne. Now look at Charlemagne. Charlemagne was going around Europe converting people. Here I am in Regensburg, Germany, at the point of a sword from paganism to Christianity.
Yep.
He's an incredibly violent man. I mean, why would we expect anything different from someone who was a political leader in this time? I don't think it reflects on Islam versus Christianity or anything like that. I think it's a mistake to frame it in that way. And there are other ways to have a conversation about it, but yeah, I think that's something, I think it's something we have to acknowledge, that there was violence. And then have to figure out a different way to deal with it rather than trying to prove, my guy's better than your guy or vice versa.
Exactly. All right. So a few more sources bringing up here. This one in particular is the Sebeos document we talked about that mentions Muhammad that you said. Yeah. And it alludes to the Arabs and Jews forming an army. If I may just to mention, it's talking about Muhammad here. Then it says, then they all gathered and in unison. And I wanted to highlight something here that your book actually does that I think is fascinating. Then they all gathered in unison from Iwila as far as Sur, which is opposite Egypt. And they went from the desert of Paran, 12 tribes, according to the tribes of the families of their patriarchs. They divided the 12,000 men like the sons of Israel into their tribes, 1,000 men from each tribe. To lead them into the land of Israel, they set off camp by camp, according to each one's patriarchal line. I'm not even going to butcher these names. These are the tribes of Ishmael. This second document right here is all the same Sebeos says all the remnants of the people of the sons of Israel gathered and united together. They formed a large army. And I just wanted people to take a second, first of all, to absorb that this is an early source that says this. In particular, I wanted to show you that so that people understand this sounds very like the book of Revelation. I'm thinking of the 12 tribes with 144,000. We know that this is a holy war in Revelation. Elaine Pagels, all the academics, Mrs. Collins, Professor Collins, she has written this extensively. This is a holy war where they are preparing for battle against the enemies of God, which would clearly be Rome at this point, the new Babylon. Just like Babylon destroyed the first temple, they destroyed the second. And to me, it sounds very apocalyptic in your type of framework that they were, I want people to read the book, but they're like empire-focused, apocalyptic end mind. And what better? I mean, the Jews, wouldn't they love to go and conquer Jerusalem so that they can have the Messiah come and rebuild the temple? I'm just saying, there's a lot here. Would you like to comment on those two sources, if you don't mind?
They were the same source, you said, right? They're both from Sebeos, right?
Yeah, just different screenshots. I apologize.
Right. No, yeah. So it's the same source. And again, it's this early source probably written in Jerusalem before Sebeos. There's a lot to unpack in that. I mean, the first passage you have, interesting you suggest the apocalypse of John. It's not the first thing I would have thought of, particularly because in this time and place in the medieval Eastern Christian tradition, the apocalypse of John is not popular. It's practically non-canonical. And actually, I wrote something on that that's on one of my websites if someone wants to track that down. But it's an interesting difference between East and West in this period in particular. So they're looking to other kinds of texts for their apocalyptic scripts. And I talk some about this actually in Apocalypse of Empire. But what I think that calls to mind, and if you go back and look at the story of the Exodus and the plans for entering the Holy Land, a lot of the way the tribes are described there, it seems to be echoing that, I think.
Like Joshua.
Well, yes, from the traditions of the Exodus, right? Not necessarily from the book Exodus, but exactly. The whole process of the Exodus, returning to the land. So I think that is what's being called to mind. I think one scholar actually, I was on a panel at the SBL once, I think, and someone said, "Oh, well, this is not real because actually all someone is doing is just writing, onto the Islamic conquest their own private memory of what the conquest of the Promised Land looked like from the biblical accounts." Is that possible? Sure. Yeah, it's possible. possible that, again, I think it can fit another narrative as well. And it's one that's borne out if one looks across a lot of sources, as I've said, that I think there was a lot of interest in the early tradition among Muhammad and his followers, primarily in getting back to this Holy Land and claiming it for themselves. I think they saw themselves in the traditions of the Exodus as coming back and reclaiming the land that had been promised to them as descendants of Ishmael, who was Abraham's eldest son, if you want to get right down to it.
Yeah.
But they're doing it in conjunction with the Jews. And I think that was also probable, that is historically probable, right? Can we say it's certain? No, but I think it's highly probable that in the early stages of this movement, it was interconfessional in this way. It involved both Jews and Muslims. To look at it, and I mentioned another point about, I think, draws us in this direction. The Quran is the one real source we have for understanding Islam in the first century. And it's a tricky source. By everyone's agreement, this is a text that preserves traditions from the first century of Islam. Now, when we think the Quran as we have it is collected and authorized and established, there's some debate about that. I have a big book coming out on that. Should be out in the fall. It's going to be open access. Everyone can read it for free.
What?
Oh, yeah. Creating the Quran, it's called. University of California is publishing it. It argues for a whole lot of reasons that we really have to think of the Quran as a text that's in process longer than most people would think, probably until the end of the 7th century. But in any case, the traditions that are in there, these are traditions from the 600s. Right. And some of them are perhaps quite earlier than the Quran's finalization. If you look at the Quran, well, first of all, the Quran is a problematic text for trying to reconstruct the Islam of the first century, right? Because it's not like the Gospels. It doesn't tell, or the Acts, or even Paul's letters. It doesn't tell us the story of the early community, right? Instead, it's about things long, long time ago. It's not really even about Muhammad. Muhammad's only mentioned very few times by name in the Quran. What it's about is it's about everything that came before Muhammad. It's about Abraham. It's about Moses. It's about Jesus. But if you look to see who is the single most prominent figure in the Quran, certainly not Muhammad. It's not even Abraham, which you might expect, but it's Moses. Why is it Moses? Why? Because they're understanding themselves as, following a new Moses, I think. Right. This is the most important part of their religious identity and their religious convictions in these early decades. They believe it is their divine, not only divine right, but divine responsibility to reclaim the land that has been promised to them. And we see this in Sebeos. But your viewers might be interested in a book I can strongly recommend by a good friend of mine, Fred Donner. I don't know if he's come up on your podcast or not, but he wrote a book called Muhammad and the Believers. And in it he argues that the best interpretation of all the evidence we have, and I would agree with him, this is the best interpretation of the evidence that we have. It's not perfect. There are problems. There are problems with every interpretation of the evidence that we have. But I think this best fits the evidence, and that is that in the earliest decades, the new religious community that Muhammad had founded, that he was leading, and that continued on beyond his death, was indeed an interconfessional community that welcomed Jews and Christians together under a single banner, under a single faith, under Muhammad's leadership while he's alive, under the leadership of his successors after his death, but without conversion, right? This was not a new sect that one had to leave one's former faith to join. Instead, I think what it was, and I feel pretty confident in this as a hypothesis, that this movement was a kind of monotheist renewal movement that welcomed all Abrahamic monotheists together who were willing to profess belief in the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Ishmael, and also belief in the last day. And one finds this a lot. This is a short sort of creed one finds a lot in the early Islamic tradition. Belief in God and the last day. The last day, of course, being the apocalypse, the eschaton. And Muhammad's prophecy even is not so important in some of the earliest layers, it seems. Muhammad seems to simply be the kind of leader. He has religious authority, I think, but I'm not sure. I don't think in the early decades, he's seen as having a unique revelation. He's kind of a warner. He's been raised up by God at the end of time he's sort of a John the Baptist figure, if you're really looking for an analogy, right? He's raised up by God at the end of time to warn people to repent, But he also wants them to come. He thinks part of this coming apocalypse involves taking back the land that had been promised to them. So I think Sebeos is a really important witness to this. He doesn't include Christians, but there's a lot of other evidence that suggests Christians had some sort of involvement like this. Christians are, of course, the most difficult case because your viewers probably know, the Quran polemicizes on occasions about the Christian belief in the Trinity, right? That is the hard part of this hypothesis. But before continuing on more than with that, though, I would just suggest that they get Fred's book, Fred Donner, Muhammad and the Believers, and check it out for themselves if they haven't already. It's actually a book that's written for a pretty broad audience.
It actually leads to the different questions. There's hypotheses that the version of Christianity wasn't, incorporating a Trinitarian concept, maybe like the early Ebionites or something. A version of this might have existed. But one of your colleagues that you worked with, I recently interviewed, Michael Penn, Dr. Penn, came on talking about Syriac Christianity, and he was discussing this and talking about there was different kinds out here, but I wonder if they're polemicizing against Christianity, period. And if that is, then maybe this is, like you said, a development, and they've started taking a stance, which also has them shifting the direction of their focus away from Jerusalem and more into, these Jews and these Christians just aren't getting with the program. We're going to do our own thing. Or Jews rejected going deeper into Muhammad as they started to favor him. Who knows? And they started to say, we need to divorce this. We can't be as close as we were, which causes a lot of issues that maybe historically caused the development here. I don't know. I'm just throwing out speculation here just to get an idea. But
So I think something like that is probably the best way to understand it, something like the latter point. As for non-Trinitarian Christians being behind the Quran, I just think that's a non-starter. We don't have good evidence that there are non-Trinitarian Christians around at this time. There were, it's true, in the earlier Christian centuries, but past the 4th century, we don't really have that. And we don't have these kind of so-called Jewish Christians. So I think we have to look for explanations that don't look back to those kinds of hypotheses.
Something to add, though, in favor of your interpretation of them collecting 1,000 men from 12 tribes, let's say, as potentially literally not ridiculous to assume that historically happened, is, first of all, look at the conquering they did achieve. You can't do that with 3 guys. You got to have a massive gathering of people to do the kind of accomplishments they did achieve so quickly. The only people who did better than them in terms of achievement would be Mongolians. But that in terms of the quickness and growth that they did in conquering. But the other thing is, I tell this to people all the time who are critical of my New Testament studies and stuff, and they go, oh, that's a myth. All of that is literary. Have you ever met anybody, I ask, that, believed in a text and wanted to formulate their life in compliance to what they believe to be true? It's almost like if, let's say an ancient Hebrew text says something about baptizing to be cleansed from sins, or assume washing away our sins. And here you have Jews in the 1st century washing themselves to cleanse themselves of sins. Oh, is that mythical because you found an ancient text that says it? No, they believe it and they're mimicking what it is. So it's very likely what you're saying potentially is true. I'm not ruling out the possibility that this is a formulae of some literary, whatever. But it does seem like this could be the case. If I may, I want to bring up this one Doctrina Jacobi here, where it says, Jacob said, and if your brother turns you away, or the Jews who are mixed up with the Saracens, the Arabs, what shall we do? And Justice said, trust in God, Mr. Jacob, that if the Jews and the Saracens impede me or cut my body up, little piece by little piece, I shall not renounce Christ, the Son of God. What do you say of this particular passage here? Do you have any comment?
It's an interesting passage. I don't know that I've ever really, I can't remember if I've commented on it before or not. It surprises me that we find a text that like this that would be aware of sort of this Jewish Arab alliance under Muhammad, but certainly one's tempted to read it in that way, that they know that this is kind of an interconfessional movement. I don't know that I've ever advanced that argument, but just sort of looking at it on the surface, it would seem to suggest that there's an awareness even this early of something like that. And the key document for this, just to shift gears a little bit, is we have something within the Islamic tradition itself that we call, for lack of a better term, the Constitution of Medina. And it's something that's preserved within the Islamic tradition. And most skeptical scholars, as well as the most traditional scholars, agree that this is probably a record of a document that was actually produced. Now, is it the actual words of that document? No, but does it transmit with some degree of fidelity a document that Muhammad drew up with the tribes of Yathrib when he got there? And I think everyone would agree that it does. And one of the most interesting things about this document is it says that the Jewish tribes in Medina will remain in their own customs. They will continue to govern themselves according to the Torah, right? And they will be a people, the Jews, who are a part of this larger group that the document identifies as the believers. Now, the non-Jewish tribes are going to convert to, quote unquote, Islam, convert to Muhammad's new form of monotheism. But there's no sense from this document that the Jewish tribes have to stop being Jewish to be a part of the community that Muhammad's leading. Again, this is from the Islamic tradition. The Islamic tradition itself, I think, will acknowledge that, yes, there was a time when Muhammad got to Medina and he thought he could have this kind of a community that included Jews as Jews. The only question is, how long did this last? Well, the Islamic tradition wants to say, Muhammad was a generous guy and he tried it out for a little while, but, then the Jews were really bad and we get some nice anti-Jewish stuff, or I shouldn't say nice because it's not nice, but we get some pretty typical anti-Jewish stuff. The Jews did this, that, and the other thing, and so Muhammad stopped doing that. So, maybe you have the impression it lasted a couple months or so. But if we take that document and, again, compare it to a lot of other sources and look for a tendency, is there a tendency that supports that there was something like this in the early years, in the early decades? And it turns out there is. There's a lot of evidence. And again, the best place to see that is going to be Fred Donner's book, Muhammad and the Believers.
Thank you. Yeah, just to highlight that again, is just what really gets me is there's this idea, Justice is saying, like, when the Jews and the Arabs come, like, there's this idea, at least, that even if they cut me up into pieces, this sounds like warfare, together, Jews and Saracens. That's the evidence I was trying to point at, and just wondering if this was solid proof that Muhammad may have led an invasion, coupled with everything else you discussed, the fact that there's Muslim and non-Muslim sources. I think that we're getting closer to something probabilistic without going, oh, we know. I don't like absolute certainty, but it seems I just hope we find more evidence. That's all. I'd be interested in seeing more. So, let me ask you this: is for reasons. Let's get into something here before we go into our just free talk. Before I let you go, reason for leaving out Muhammad invasion of Palestine in biographies. There are two interesting things that caught my eye, and the first is this hadith. And this particular hadith, they call it the two-finger hadith, if you will, narrated by Sa bin Sa'd Asadi. I don't know how to pronounce these names very well, but it says, Allah's messenger, holding out his middle finger and index finger, said, my advent and the hours are like this, or like these. Namely, the period between his era and the hour is like the distance between those two fingers, i.e. short. And I don't know, it's like, I don't know how much distance there is, but it's any second now.
That's the point, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, I see this all over the New Testament. I see this even in Second Temple Judaism.
Well, what I want to do with those kinds of traditions is follow through the logic that generally governs how we approach apocalypticism in study of the gospel traditions and early Christianity, right? I mean, there are historical Jesus scholars out there who say, oh no, Jesus wasn't an apocalypticist. He was this wise philosopher. And some of these people are my friends. But I honestly think that the only reason you would come to that conclusion is if you are desperately trying to avoid what seems more probable, right? You're desperately trying to avoid it because you don't want a Jesus who's irrelevant. You want a Jesus that can somehow be salvaged for some kind of liberal Protestantism or Catholicism as this wise sage figure, rather than someone who was running around telling people, get ready because the world's going to end. I think that's the most historically probable reconstruction we have of Jesus. And the logic with a lot of this goes is that, so we know people are going to make up traditions. We know that not every tradition we have about Jesus, about Muhammad, about Stephen Shoemaker, right, is necessarily rooted in something that actually happened, right? So we know there are going to be these traditions that people remember for whatever reason, or even make up on purpose, perhaps, for whatever reason. Then we look at these eschatological traditions, right? So Muhammad was wrong about that, at least, right? The hour was not that close. Or you can say, it was a metaphor. It's measuring in God's time, right? In terms of eternity. Right, sure, fine. If you want to go that way, but if you're a historian and you're looking at this, if you're thinking probably how that was understood when he said it to people, it's coming soon. So the question an historian asks is, okay, if we're trying to figure out which traditions are more likely to have been invented later on and which are more likely to go back to something Muhammad said, it's traditions like this that are less likely, one can argue, to have been made up because it's falsified. It didn't happen. So would someone 100 years after Muhammad's dead make up a tradition that Muhammad said about the hour, it's this close, when it wasn't? Right? The more logical understanding, the more probable, I should say, in fairness, the more probable understanding of that tradition, I think, is that it must go back to something that Muhammad really said, because no one would make it up given that it made him look wrong. The only reason someone would keep telling it is because probably it was a very early memory that established itself in the community as something that they all believed was the core of Muhammad's message.
And it's also, cognitive dissonance studies, right? So they could still apply it to themselves, second, third, fourth generation could still see it as relevant because, he's saying still soon. And Christians today still think the end is soon. And it's like, it's been 2,000 years and you still think soon, but you don't get that term mellow in its original context, what it's actually saying. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention because I knew you would definitely be all over it like white on rice. The second statement is by Umar. And to give people kind of a tease, right here, the history of Al-Tabari, the last years of the prophet. So you can go and source me, go check out my sources, make sure that what I'm doing and saying is on point. And in this book in particular, there's a statement. Umar stood up and spoke before him after praising God, extolling him with what was due, et cetera, et cetera. Then he goes on to say, but I thought that the messenger of God would conduct our affairs until he was the last of us alive. Did Muhammad and the early Muslims believe that the end of the world would happen in their lifetime? Is this a hint at that?
I think they probably did. I think I'm not the first person to suggest that, but it is a pretty radical minority opinion. But yeah, based on texts like that, and other hadith that I talk about in the death of a prophet in particular, I think it was their expectation that it was coming so soon that it would come even before Muhammad died. And actually, one of the arguments in favor of that is Muhammad really doesn't seem to have done a very good job of planning for what would happen after he died, right? Because some of your viewers, listeners may know that there was this very bitter struggle after Muhammad died over who would lead the community, right? And it's this struggle, particularly in relation to Ali, his son-in-law, that ultimately split the community fairly early on into Shi'i and Sunni. Another probability one could suggest is if Muhammad had made it very clear, when I die, I want so-and-so to lead the community, I'm not sure he would have had that, although this is actually what the Shi'i tradition would say, that Muhammad did say that. They said it was supposed to be Ali, and then these guys stole it from him. And then they purged it from the Quran so that all the evidence for that has now been destroyed. But I'm more of the case that I think he didn't do this because he really didn't think he was going to die before the end came. And that passage is also interesting too, because in response, a new Quranic verse is introduced to say that no, of course you're wrong, because Muhammad said every prophet's going to die, right? And the fascinating thing about this is the text itself, if you continue on a little bit further down from there, it says the people, when they heard this Quranic verse, everyone was shocked. No one had heard it before. I mean, can you imagine if we had early texts like this saying this about a particular verse in the gospel or something like this? There was a controversy in the community, and then, Peter came and said this, and everyone was like, wow, we've never heard that before. Wouldn't that just be like alarm bells going off that here is something that was an interpolation? I think so.
I think you hit the nail on the head, because my Jesus studies, I have a weird hypothesis in my mind, and I don't know if it's weird or if there's others who back me on this, but I think Jesus didn't plan this either. And I am kind of prone to think Jesus thought of the Son of Man as the Danielic figure, not himself as the Son of Man, and then he becomes the Son of Man when Christology takes off its own mutation, which is a huge, complex discussion. But there was a power struggle right off the gate, in my opinion, between Paul and the Jerusalem people, James, Cephas, etc. And I think that it was not planned. Cognitive dissonance sets in. The end was supposed to happen. And even Paul's thinking, any moment now. In fact, hey, Thessalonians, I know your family members have died, but this is what I see. And I'm beginning to kind of have this image wondering, is this empire, this growth, if you will, the early Islamic understanding is apocalyptic, just like what I see in the New Testament. And of course, it doesn't stop it, but it might transform the direction the thinking was, which makes me wonder, going a little further, could it be the reason they wrote him out of going into Palestine and conquering, Jerusalem and whatnot, is because he failed? The second coming, that the end didn't happen? I don't know. Makes me wonder. Could be.
I mean, I remember presenting this material a long time ago to colleagues of mine at the University of Oregon, and one of them pointed out in sort of comparison to Muhammad and Moses, and this is actually, according to these traditions, Muhammad succeeds where Muhammad succeeds where Moses didn't. Moses didn't get to lead the people into the promised land, but according to some of these sources, Muhammad did. I just don't know that my hypothesis isn't so much that they wrote him out because he failed, quote unquote, because he was wrong about the timing of the eschaton, the end of the world, so much as it's not a matter of him being right or wrong. It's a matter of that it didn't happen. And once it didn't happen, they had to readjust a lot of their expectations. And one of those expectations, I think, or one of these beliefs, was the significance of the Holy Land. Right. And once the Holy Land was not their primary sacred geography, that meant it would make more sense to remember Muhammad's life differently as having taken place in the new sacred geography, which I do think there is a reorientation to diminish Jerusalem and raise up the cities of the Hijaz as the main focus of Islamic sacred geography. And I think it's in the process just of rethinking that, not on purpose. I don't think one even has to say that someone, said, okay, we got to change the traditions about Muhammad's life because we're changing, where we think our sacred geography is. Memory just doesn't work like that. And actually, the book on the Quran I have coming forth, I have a lot of stuff on memory science, a lot of it inspired by my mentor, Bart's book on Jesus before the Gospels, actually trying to think a similar way about Islam that he does there about Christianity. So, I just think it would have been, one hates to use a word like natural, but I think it would have been expected that the end of Muhammad's life would be remembered so that he dies in the Islamic Holy Land, rather than that he is leading the conquest of this land that is no longer the primary Islamic Holy Land, but it's sort of a secondary Holy Land still, because they can't quite forget.
Very well put. Well, here we have multiple sources, multiple attestations saying very similar things. They don't contradict each other about him going into the promised land or to take over the Palestine, which is where the holy sites are, where Jesus, Moses, the whole nine, all the Abrahamic faiths are really centered there. And now we're shifting down to Mecca and Medina. And the question I have for the audience as they're going into this, as I bring this up, is how trustworthy should we trust the Islamic sources to give us accurate accounts in this, the life of Muhammad? And those who are interested in sourcing me, go check it out. There's a translation of Ibn Ishaq's, I don't want to butcher any names here, but in particular, there's this phrase that says, things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people, and such reports as al-Baqai told me he could not accept as trustworthy, all these things I have omitted. There's omissions, there's probably interpolations, especially when it's faith ridden. My question is, should we trust? I mean, what is it possible in this particular source, for example, and I'll bring it back up if you'd be interested, but I'm reading that highlight, and is it possible this Muslim historian's admitting editing parts of Muhammad's biography out?
Well, everyone does that, right? I mean, everyone is selective in terms of how they bring forward the past into the future. I mean, Christian historians do this, and sometimes they may or may not tell us they're doing it. But the broader question here for me is just generally how reliable should we view these Islamic sources? And I think, again, it can speak from a fairly genuine consensus among scholars of early Islam who are critical that we can't trust them very much. They are highly suspect, and we have to kind of approach them from the perspective of suspicion. And anything we're going to take out of them, we kind of have to then prove, starting from a position of suspicion. And just to sort of simply explain why, well, I mean, if one wants a more complicated argument of why we might conclude that about these sources, there's a big article I published many years ago called In Search of Urwa's Sira. And again, you can find this on one of my websites if you want, where it's almost a monograph. It's a 100-page article.
Wow.
Very technical. Most of your audience probably wouldn't care much for the debates in it, but it explains why we really can't trust these sources to accurately reproduce what happened in the 7th century. And the simplest explanation is the first written sources about the life of Muhammad were written down 100 years after he's dead. 100 years, right? Now, they didn't just make it up, of course not. They're based on, memory and oral tradition. But they're based on 100 years of individual memory and oral tradition. And again, as I'll explain in a lot more detail in the forthcoming book on creating the Quran, that's just not accurate. It's been proven not accurate time and time again, especially after 100 years. Memories will change fundamentally. So we have then in the first written source, a source that's based in memories that are going to have changed dramatically. And we also think, and I certainly suspect, that quote unquote Islam 100 years after Muhammad's death is quite different from the new religious movement that he founded in the 620s and into the 630s, right? And so what's remembered about those times is going to be remembered in ways that comport with how Muhammad's followers, the Muslims, understood themselves and their faith 100 years later. But then we don't even have that. We don't have what was written down at that time. That text is lost. Instead, we only have it as other writers, another 100 or so years later, revised it, right?
What?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's really that bad. So it's there are two analogies to give for this, and they're weak in different ways, but they get to the point. So one is, this is Patricia Crona makes this point. It's like if we imagine the first person to write the life of Jesus were, say, Justin Martyr. And we only had an account of what Justin wrote as it had been revised by Origen of Alexandria. I mean, the question I pose after that example in Death of Prophets, do you think that this Jesus would look like an apocalyptic prophet, saying the world's about to end, or do you think he might look a lot like a Middle Platonic philosopher? I suspect strongly the latter, right? Yep. To put it another way, and I think this is a less helpful analogy, but it still, I think, can make this hit home. Imagine if for the founding of the United States, we didn't have any real contemporary sources. Maybe we had things that the French and the Spanish were writing about what was going on, but we didn't have any documents from people who were founding the United States. Maybe we had the Constitution, although I think the Quran does not compare favorably to the Constitution in my mind in terms of clarity and as a clear witness to what's going on in events of Muhammad's new religious movement. So say the first actual history of that formation of our great republic was written down only, say, 100 years later in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
And that's the first time we had it, right? And actually in Islam, we've been through a couple civil wars by this time, by the way. And splits with Shia and Sunni. And we also have in Islam, too, we have an empire that can control how narratives get written in a way that is distinctive to a lot of how Islamic history is produced. But so we don't even have that. We don't have the history of the founding of the Republic of the United States of America as it was written in the aftermath of the Civil War. Instead, we have that only as it was then revised by the hippies you went to New York with. No, I'm kidding. But we say we had it as revised in, say, the 1960s and 70s, right? And so then it's very much revised to fit that time. Now that this is, I appreciate for all you people out there rolling your eyes at this. Okay, I get it. I hear you. It is a bit of a stretch, this metaphor, but it is a way that I think in our own history, it can give us a sense of the expanse of time in the production of these various stages of the collective memory of Islamic origins, and also the fact that these were produced in different circumstances, right? Maybe not as charged and different as the postbellum period and the 1960s in the United States, but at the same time, if you can maybe give me a little grain of salt with that, you can get a better perspective on why these sources are suspect as they are now.
Amazing. I don't think I could say anything better other than just to add to what you said is just use Christianity as an analogy, of course, and imagine we have sources, right? Before Justin Martyr, we have sources that go back before Justin, before Origen. And even with sources, they changed. So
Correct.
Like the movement itself within the New Testament changes. It seemed to be a Jewish only thing. This is my hunch is he's here for Jews, and it starts to evolve right in front of your eyes. So imagine what we would find if we had the sources. Now you can only, I empathize for, if I can call them Muhammad mythicists, I empathize in understanding why someone would question and doubt historicity. But at the end of the day, people exist. People exist that things aren't written about all the time. And he gets some mentions. So to make it into a title rather than a human, that's a whole nother discussion, I guess, would to have you on. But I'm with you on this. I think that, wow, I can't imagine what we don't have.
Right.
So the question is...
another thing is... Okay, let's change the topic. Give us something new.
I wanted to... Well, as we're exiting, because I want you to come back, you have been... above all, my favorite interviewer when it comes to this particular subject matter. And I really appreciate it. If I were to tell someone to go get one book right now, let's say they're like, I can only afford one. Which one would you recommend first?
I would recommend getting A Prophet Has Appeared. I think it's also maybe one of the least expensive.
Okay.
And it's also, I think, written at the most general level. Like I say, I just thought of it as something that you could use in an undergraduate classroom. And what it'll do is you can read these sources for themselves. This seems to be a real big emphasis in the way you're presenting a lot of things to your audience, right? You want to show them the manuscripts, you want to show them the text. Well, there it is. In that book, it is a selected, I call it a curated collection. I didn't just include every source that mentions anything about Muhammad. What I wanted was sources that are from basically the first century of Islam. We don't really have much in the way of sources from the Islamic tradition, only the Quran. And I wanted sources that said something about the nature of the religious beliefs and practices of this community. So if there were accounts of battles with the Roman army in Sebeos, which, of course there are, I didn't include that because I'm not interested in that, right? Fred Donner, I mentioned again, wrote a great book on the early Islamic conquest. And then Robert Hoyland, who we mentioned earlier too, right, has In God's Path, a more popular updating of kind of the history of the conquest. That stuff's there. I'm not a military historian. I'm not, I'm a religious historian. So I wanted to focus on texts that were, in my judgment, and again, it is always my judgment. You can critique it that way if you want, but I've thought about this a lot, and but I think are the best, most important things for people to read from those non-Islamic sources for thinking about what early Islam is like. So yeah, if you want to go buy one, go buy that, and then get some more, and then I'll give you a free one in the fall once Creating the Quran comes out. I
hope they do. One final question I must ask, and this just with apocalypticism in mind, we're going to have to do a follow-up episode to really entice our audience with this book, the books you've written. But I think of Jesus, and I think of him as another Joshua. The difference is he's not warfare, it seems. Now, there are a few serious scholars who think that it's been whitewashed and that he might have been a rebel. I do think that there might be historical precedents for him trying to cleanse the temple, which might have been what got him.
Oh, yeah, I think that's true.
I think that there's something to that. I really do. My question is, Joshua with the warfare, with the sword, everywhere I step, this will be God's land, like we will conquer this will be the empire of God, and couple that with apocalypticism that we find in the Jewish thought down into the 7th century, you mix Joshua and Second Temple Judaism in some wild way in thinking. It seems like you have the early rise of Islam with a prophet-like figure or Joshua-like figure leading it. Am I on? I mean, is this a good hypothesis in your thinking?
Yeah, I haven't thought much about Muhammad and Joshua. I think there are a couple old articles about how in the traditional Islamic biographies, there are some ways in which he's portrayed like Joshua. But no, I mean, probably there's something to that. I think Moses is really the clear figure that's in the Quran that comes to the fore, much more so than, say, a Joshua figure would. But yeah, I mean, the other element that you didn't mention, which is really a key part of Apocalypse of Empire, is that by the time we get to the 7th century, apocalypticism had become imperialized, right? And it was joined to the idea of an empire. And the narrative about Jewish apocalypticism in the 1st century BCE, CE is that it's anti-imperial. Well, by the time we're getting to the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, it's already been deeply imperialized. Thank you. So it's such that the belief is that actually the end is not going to come around by destroying all empires. Actually, there's going to be an empire, a divinely chosen empire, that's going to bring about the end of the world. And I think this is a script that's informing Muhammad and his followers. They think they are going to be this people. The Romans think it's going to be them, right? There's even a way in which the Sasanian Persians have scripts that they're obviously not in a Judeo-Christian Abrahamic line, but they too have scripts about how the Persian Empire is going to be pivotal in the events of bringing about the end of time. One sees this in the Jewish apocalypticism of this period as well, new ideas about empire. So I think, I ended up going on this line because when I said Muhammad was an apocalypticist in more than one context after the death of a prophet, people say, well, that's impossible, right? Why on earth would he bother conquering the world if he thought the world was going to end? And more than once, my response was, but that's how people thought the world was going to end in his time. And people would look at me like, yeah, right. And so I realized, well, I guess I need to write a book that will explain how, indeed, that is how people thought the world was going to end, and how what's going on in the first decades in Muhammad's new religious movement, the first decades of its history, seems to really fit onto that script.
I'm reading that book right now, and I'm reading that book, and that's exactly what I'm finding. And what's interesting about what you're saying is, I think I'm reading a book by a lady named Cattell Berthelot, and she wrote a book called Jew and Their Pagan Rivals. And she's really pioneering this idea of how much did pagan Rome impact Jewish thought, not Christian Rome, which we know that happened, but pagan Rome. And even to their conversion law, like they wanted to compete, even though they were like calling Rome Esau, the twin brother, but the enemy that God didn't love. They were doing this. They were competing, and to the point where their laws, their ideas impacted and shaped the way the Jews would formulate their own laws. So I imagine here we have these Arabs down in the south who see massive kingdoms, Persia and Rome, combating over and over, and they're the ones who are coming up with this empire type apocalypticism. And sure enough, we're going to do it better, or we're going to jump into this battle here and take them down while they're weak, and they do. So thank you so much. Is there anything we didn't say that you want to say to our audience?
There's so much more to say, but yeah, maybe another time.
Seriously, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to get this out there to the public. Ladies and gentlemen, in the description, check out his website, check our sources, go get his books, be on the lookout. I hope we'll have more with him this soon. Fingers crossed, and never forget, we are MythVision.